Hello everyone, and welcome to part 13 of our journey through the Old Testament. This is the final part. It's been a long journey. We've covered over 2,000 years of history. In parts 2 to 12, we're dealing with biblical history. The point I'm trying to make here is that is history written from the point of view of God's call to Abraham and eventually to his people through Abraham's line. How that was worked out through history is what we call sacred history. But it's only fair to say that without the Old Testament, we would know very little from history about the people of Israel, because after all, history is written by the big players, the empires. And we've certainly seen empires come and go over this 2,000-year period. It's different in this last part, because in part 13, apart from a few extra biblical accounts, and I'll explain that as we go through, we have very little evidence, scant evidence, of the life of little Judah. What we do know is that the clash of empires, Judah was often in the middle of it. The Fertile Crescent, the big players in the north, Egypt in the south, and the Fertile Crescent and little Judah was often the field of conflict, the final finishing line. Often empires were decided in that area. But the miracle is that Yahweh's chosen people did survive, did remain intact, and are still with us today. It's important also for the Christian to understand that, as St. Paul teaches in Romans chapter 11, that Yahweh has not finished with them yet. So let's explore the last 400 or so years to the birth of Jesus Christ. I've begun this section by, first of all, showing you some maps. In the last 400 or so years that we're covering in this final part, there was a great shift in empires. In the last part, in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we're under the Persian Empire, and that Persian Empire soon began to be threatened. And then onto the world scene came Alexander the Great, and he, in a few short years, spread his influence and his empire into areas that had never been touched before. Legend has it that he even reached the Indus River, which of course is India itself. But Alexander didn't live very long, and as we shall see, his empire was divided up, and we'll see where little Palestine ended up in this division of empire. But there was, through Alexander, a growing influence of Greece and what became really the Greek Empire. And so by 240 BC, you can see that the Greek Empire, which we call the Hellenistic Empire, had grown to fulfill and to touch most of the areas that the Seleucid Empire had touched. And again, we'll look at that. What is the Seleucid Empire? But in our last one, by 90 BC, the Roman Empire was beginning to expand, and it took over. It absorbed the Greek Empire and expanded it, so that in this last map we see that by the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire was really, it surrounded the Mediterranean. This map shows Britannia still not conquered, but of course it was shortly after that. So we've seen a real shift of empires in a 500 or less than that year period. So let's look at the timeline as far as we can discern it, because it's not clear in many ways, and we're having to use the change of kings and empires as a kind of a reference when we look at what was happening in Israel. Well, the book of Nehemiah begins us on that journey. We know that he arrived in Jerusalem about 445 BC, and he set about to encourage the people, the disillusioned and the demoralized people, to rebuild the temple and the city. And that's under roughly Darius II. But as I said, the Greeks were beginning to rise in power. But Darius was a wily king. By diplomacy, bribery and Greek corruption, he was able to maintain the empire, but the clouds were gathering. The last thing we know really from the books of Nehemiah and Ezra is that a man called Bagoras became governor around 400 BC. We don't know whether Bagoras was a Jew or a Gentile, but he governed really on behalf of the king, the emperor, and to extract as much money and valuables out of Judah, Israel, as they possibly could. What aided him was the internal power struggles in the high priestly family, with actually one brother murdering another brother. Eventually, Darius II, after really less than 20 years, died, and really Persia began its terminal decline. And by 331, it was an empire no more, because Alexander the Great had conquered the world. He swept through first Greece, then the Persian Empire, as I said, conquering, as legend has it, as far as the Indus River. Persia was no more. But the problem was that Alexander caught a disease of some sort and died very quickly, perhaps just 3 years after his conquest. He had 4 generals, and in his will it is said that he split his empire into 4. Now there's only 2 generals that we need to look at, because they had a great impact on Judah and Israel. And the first one that grabbed it was Ptolemy, who also kept Egypt. And so Ptolemy had a sort of the bottom half of Palestine, and the other half was Seleucus or Seleucus. And so little Judah is in the hands of the Ptolemies. We don't know what life was like in the Ptolemaic period, which lasted really from 323 to around 146 BC, but all seems to be quiet. They seem to be able to get on with things. No doubt there were intrigues, and no doubt there were frightens and scares, but the problem came when the other general of note, Seleucus Nicator began the Seleucid Empire at the same time, but power soon began to decline. But that was halted by Antiochus III. Palestine was taken from Ptolemy, and not the same Ptolemy. Ptolemy the First was the land grab general, but Ptolemy the Fifth grabbed the Palestine in 198 BC. Now, life for Israel at first, under the Seleucids, as they're called, was encouraging, but as time went on, would become very difficult and dangerous, because creeping into the empire was the influence of Greek culture. That was ushered in really by Alexander, but it began to grow and became very popular culture. It was cultured. Some of the great philosophers like Socrates, Herodotus were all from around that period. Athens became the cultural capital, and the influence spread out, Greek thought and customs. Well, this led to splits and divisions within the Jerusalem and Judah. And things began to come to a head under Antiochus III. He took on the growing might of Rome, but was roundly defeated in 190 BC and was driven back into Asia. Paying heavy reparations, he imposed heavy taxes and connived to rob the temple treasury. Greek ways grew in intensity until even a gymnasium was built in Jerusalem. Resentment simmered, especially among pious Jews, who were puzzling anyway as to what had happened to this great vision of God's kingdom. And bloodshed was soon to follow. And it followed under Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. Epiphanes actually means born of gods. So he took on not just a royal title, but he took on a god title. And in order to unify his domain, he brought in all things Greek. He imposed Greek culture. He declared himself to be Zeus incarnate and required worship of his image. And an image of Zeus was raised in the temple in 167 BC. Well, you can imagine the resentment which had been smouldering burst into flame. But of course there was corruption at the top. While the legitimate high priest Onias III was away, his position was usurped by his brother Joshua, a Hellenized Jew. And the first book of Maccabees, which we're going to look at next, recounts what happened. And I'll explain where the book of Maccabees comes from further down in this talk. Here we have a few verses from Maccabees. And it's about that some Jews followed Greek customs. Others stayed away, and it says here they even had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant, started associating with Gentiles, and did all sorts of other evil things. Of course, worshipping Zeus was the most evil thing. By this time, Judaism was split. Pious Jews, who became known as the Hasidim, began to form a rebel army. And that army, under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, Jerusalem was retaken in 164-165. The temple was cleansed and rededicated. Judas made a treaty with Rome, which did secure freedom for Israel for a time, but that wouldn't last. After the death of Judas Maccabeus, then the lawless traitors, as they're talked about here, begin to grow. And the governor, Bacchides, appointed renegade Jews as rulers over the country and brought in all sorts of humiliation. The plight of pious Jews, the explanation is just absolutely horrific, what they did to them to try to get them to recant. And of course, a lot of them would flee to the hills. Jonathan succeeded as leader of the Jews and renewed the fight. After the fall of Demetrius, Alexander the First, he made a treaty with Jonathan, but his reign only lasted 3 years, and so peace didn't last very long at all. Jonathan was succeeded by Simon, who again had highs and lows, but was regarded as a patriot. He again renewed his treaty with Rome, and after Simon was murdered, he was succeeded by his son John. And at that point, intimate detail ceases, and we have to rely on other sources, of which there really aren't any that are of much use. Now, Judea from 134 BC becomes a minor player in international events, for Rome was beginning to march across the world stage. When Rome took over Judea, they appointed local kings. Not quite sure why they did that, but that's what they did. And enter the Herods, of course, which are well known from the Gospels. Herod Antipater was a wealthy nobleman from Edom. Edom was the centre of the world perfume trade, so he'd grown very, very rich. Had a son in 73 BC, who became known as Herod the Great. Now Pompey, the Roman general, invaded Palestine in 63 BC, and it became a Roman province, with Herod Antipater as governor. And he made his son, Herod the Great, governor of Galilee in 43 BC. And when his father died, Herod II, Herod became king of Judea. And he died mad around about 4 BC. And he's the Herod that slaughtered the innocent children trying to find Jesus. He was succeeded by his sons, and that brings us to New Testament times, the end of the Old Testament and the in-between period. Okay, the struggle to remain pure. With temple worship destroyed during the exile, pious Jews began to rethink their faith in Yahweh, and the focus shifted to the law given by Moses, known as Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We can see this shift when we look through the Psalms, because by the time of Psalm 119, it is all about law, and Psalm 119 has 176 verses, and each verse mentions the law in some form or other. Law, statutes, covenant, precepts, words like that. So the law became central. If you wanted to be a holy Jew, you kept the law. And so as Greek influence began to grow, pious Jews saw the nation moving away from pure worship of Yahweh to Greek ideas, and so they began to separate themselves. The title they became known as were the Hasidim, which means holy in the land. Now, they chose different ways to try to remain holy. Some formed communities, desert communities, and the most famous one, of course, is the Qumran community near the Dead Sea, where their scroll library was found in 1947, hidden in a cave, and has illuminated the Old Testament and the intertestamental period from the Qumran point of view a great deal in the years that have followed that. Others took arms in guerrilla warfare to free Israel, like Judas Maccabeus, who gathered a rebel army around him. And even by Jesus' time, there were still groups banding together whom were called the Zealots. The holy ones who tried to stay within and be part of temple worship but keep themselves holy they became the Pharisees. Now, to keep the law totally and purely, you had to live a very separate life. The Pharisees could do that because they were wealthy people. Now, the New Testament portrait of the Pharisees shows them with great negativity, but there were good and pious Pharisees. The great teacher who taught Paul, Gamaliel, was an outstanding example of that. And then, of course, we have the man who came to see Jesus secretly at night, Nicodemus, who was a pious Jew and tried to defend Jesus during his trial. So they weren't all bad, though we do meet some rotters in the New Testament. The ones who compromised with the Greeks were the Sadducees, and they became, at Jesus' time, really the ruling family. Now, where does the book of Maccabees come from? It comes from what's called the Apocrypha. If you look at most Bibles, the Apocrypha is not there, though you can get them with Apocrypha. Most Roman Catholic Bibles will have the Apocrypha in it. I've got a Jerusalem Bible, which is a Roman Catholic Bible, and that's got the Apocrypha woven into the Old Testament text. Basically, what happened was that when they were compiling the Old Testament, some books they weren't sure about, and so they excluded them. And when you read through them, you can see reasons why. But it is there. You can get information from it, and certainly from 1 Maccabees, we get a great deal about this intertestamental period. Just want to finish with looking at Jesus, Paul, and the law. Jesus said very clearly that he came not to do away with the law of Moses, but he came to fulfill them. There isn't room here or place for me to totally explain that, but basically keeping the law, the Torah, in its completion was the way to be right with God. Trouble was, nobody can do it. So how can people be right with God? And Christians believe that it was Jesus' death on the cross as the pure, perfect Son of God who opened the way to friendship with God. And so being right with God is through faith and through grace. And that doesn't mean to say we haven't got to be holy, but we are holy because we allow God to change us and make us into what we can never be ourselves. Paul, of course, who was a Pharisee, he'd been taught by Gamaliel himself. He saw both through his own life and experience and through that wonderful vision that he had encountered with Jesus on the road to Damascus. He saw that the law was about showing us what is right and what is wrong. The law is a policeman. It can't make us good and holy. It can only show us when we're being unholy and breaking God's commandments. And just as a simple illustration, if I'm driving along a road and I see a 30-mile-an-hour sign and I ignore it and drive at 40, I am breaking the law. That sign has the power to show me I'm breaking the law, but there's no power to stop me breaking the law. But it is only by grace And that puts both Jew and Gentile onto the same footing. Both need the grace of God to be right with God. So we finish our long journey, not looking back, but looking to the future. When the exiles returned to Judea, they were so full of hope. God was going to establish his kingdom. It would be greater than the kingdom of David, and they would rule on his behalf. And the time would not be a short period, but it would be unending. Of course, that never happened. And so rather than losing hope, they cast that hope into the future. We can do that, can't we, as human beings? Well, it hasn't happened today, but it'll happen next week. And so what grew was this apocalyptic vision. There would be the battle to end all battles, and then there would be peace, and they would be the victors in the battle. We have that at the end of Daniel. And there is traces of it too in the Apocrypha and other literature that didn't even get into the Apocrypha. When we come to the New Testament, that hope was seen in Jesus. We have this wonderful little vignette of Simeon, who is waiting for the consolation of Israel, is waiting for that hope and sees that hope in the infant Jesus. And at the ascension, of course, Jesus has died, he's risen again. For the vast majority of the Jewish population, he came and went. But for Christians, of course, they at first expected Jesus to come back again imminently. But he didn't. And so we can see, tracing through the latter part of the New Testament, that future hope again being cast into the future. And of course it comes to its fulfillment in Revelation as the last book of the New Testament, where this hope is in the second coming of Jesus at the end of time, when it will not just be political newness, but there will be a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. And so we've come to the end of our exploration. Wow, 2,000 years, and what a story it is. The ups and the downs, the triumphs and the failures, the exaltation and the sadness. But as a Christian, we look at all this as the preparation for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's as if history is like an hourglass that's turned on its side. It all goes down to a point, the birth, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus, and then expands again until we come to the time when Jesus will return. All of it is part of God's plan, his eternal plan, which Paul tells us was founded before the creation of the world. And so we sit, as the people of the Old Testament did, looking forward in expectation and trusting God for the present. So glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. Amen. Just to finish, I've used 4 sources. John Bright and Bernard Anderson, well worth reading. Bernard Anderson is a little lighter than John Bright, all been out quite a number of years, and I looked on Amazon and they're all available on Amazon. I'm sure they're available through other sources too. So all that remains for me to say is thank you for journeying with me.